Somehow, incredibly, this episode is kicking off Season 5 of Okanogan Highlands Alliance's Highland Wonders podcast. This podcast started during COVID, when podcasts were one of the only ways we could think of to keep connecting and learning about the natural history of the Okanogan Highlands without actually getting close to other people. But over the last 5 years, the podcast has grown and continues to be a stimulating and delightful part of OHA's programming, so we will keep at it. We are looking forward to hearing from many more experts and educators about their experiences and knowledge of the charismatic species and diverse ecosystems of the Okanogan Highlands of North Central Washington. My name is Jen Weddle, and I am a co-director of Okanogan Highlands Alliance, a nonprofit conservation organization dedicated to stewarding and protecting the beautiful Okanogan Highlands, which are the traditional and ancestral lands of the Okanogan First Nations in British Columbia and the Okanogan, Lakes, and Colville bands, who are now part of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation. We hope you enjoy, that you keep listening, and please do share this podcast with your friends and family so that we can continue to build a community that appreciates and protects the natural world around us. Now, we know that you are going to liken this podcast episode. We hope that you liken it so much that you recommend it to the people you liken. Jessica Allen, lichenologist, is here in this first episode of the 5th season of the Highland Wonders podcast. Recently a professor at Eastern Washington University, she has relocated to California to work in the research field. She has lived and worked all over the world, in rural and urban areas, even New York City, studying and discovering the many mysteries of the lichen world. You don't necessarily think of lichen when you think of the Bronx, but that's an amazing thing about lichen. They are found literally everywhere. After listening, we think you will be excited to pull out a magnifying lens and start exploring the multicolored, deeply textured lichen world. And now, without further ado, we present Jessica Allen, who is here to share her vast understanding and boundless enthusiasm for the diverse and extraordinary lichen.
My name is Jessica Allen, and I'm a lichenologist. Most recently, I was a tenured associate professor at Eastern Washington University in Cheney, Washington. Now I started a new job and relocated. I'm a research scientist in the Rec Peterson lab working for Howard Hughes Medical Institute at the University of California, San Diego. I've had a kind of a recent shift into more fungal cell biology, but for the past 17 years, I've been studying lichens. And I've been studying lichen conservation and evolution, naming new species, just doing basic biodiversity exploration, and kind of living fully enmeshed in that world of lichens. And it's been fantastic. And so I'm from the Tri-Cities originally, Tri-Cities, Washington. And I earned my bachelor's degree at Eastern Washington University and my PhD at the New York Botanical Garden and the City University of New York. So that was in the Bronx. Did some postdoctoral research in Switzerland at a research institute outside of Zurich, and then came back to Eastern Washington for this job at Eastern Washington University. Somebody once told me when I was younger that if you want to travel, be a scientist. And they were right. I did some field work in the North Cascades National Forest surrounding the national park a few years ago, and was mostly in the Methow Valley, so kind of journeyed through there. It's such an interesting ecosystem because it's like montane, but also kind of dry and cold, but not quite as dry as the Columbia Basin. The epiphytic lichens, the lichens on trees, just are so in your face there, right? Like you have so much of that, like chartreuse, yellow green wolf lichen everywhere, which is just crazy cool. Lots of horsehair lichens like Bryoria and Alectoria. And I love that you can appreciate and enjoy them in all seasons. In the winter, they're even somehow even more beautiful, I think, when there's snow around. I don't know if it's like the contrast or they're a little bit hydrated. The colors super pop. So that's really a pleasure. And then of course you have all the beautiful rock dwelling lichens too, like the elegant sunburst lichen, and that's that nice orange, or all the yellow lichens too. So tons of great lichen diversity in that area. I started studying lichens when I was an undergraduate student. And when I went to Eastern Washington University, I actually went to study music. And I did that for a year and then switched to biology with a focus on conservation biology. And when I was going through the introductory biology series, the only chapter that we skipped was on fungi. So I went back and read, well, it's a lot to cover in a year. So this is, the professor was great. I think it just push came to shove. So I went back and read it and I was like, oh my gosh, these are the coolest organisms in this whole book. I have to know more. And luckily, there was a great mycology professor at Eastern, Suzanne Schwab, and I was able to take mycology from her the very next fall, and all the fungi kind of blew my mind. It was an incredible class. And of all of the fungi I looked at, lichens just really captured my heart because they're so beautiful. Especially if you ever get them under magnification, it's just, there's nothing else like them on the planet. So even if you just get a little jeweler's loupe, it doesn't have to be powerful or fancy or expensive. Anybody who's listening, you have to do this after this podcast. You just have to get really up close and personal with some lichens, and it's incredible. And one of the things I really love about Eastern Washington as well is that the rock dwelling lichen communities are so diverse. So I think we have a tendency to be like, oh, there's a chunk of basalt or granite and maybe a few lichens on it. But if you actually stop with a hand lens and look closely at a rock, even if it's not that big, often you can find like 20 different things on there. It's just crazy. So it was kind of a love at first sight. And also that I'd been kind of aware of lichens growing up, like camping on the Olympic Peninsula with my mom, and there are all so many big lichens out there. And it wasn't like I wasn't aware of them, but I had no idea how many there were. And so there's always this kind of hiding in plain sight effect that then once you start seeing them, it's like, oh my gosh, they're everywhere. So yeah, so I would say that's how I initially got into it. And then probably also why I've stayed. Every time I go anywhere and look at lichens, whether it's in my own neighborhood or farther afield, there's always a surprise and there's always something new to discover, and I just like enjoy spending time looking really closely at them and trying to understand them better. What are lichens? People are sometimes confused about that, right? And even if they live somewhere like the Okanogan Highlands or so much of Washington where they see lichens a lot and they maybe have noticed them, sometimes they don't really know what they are, which I think is the first really interesting thing about lichens, because most organisms you're like, that's a tree and that's a plant and that's a bird, but you're like, what is that? When you look at a lichen, and it is a little bit complicated what they are. And so they're what we call obligate symbioses. And at like the most basic level, we define lichens as fungi and algae that live together to co-create those lovely structures that we see. And all of the names of lichens apply to the fungus, because that main fungus, and just take a step back, fungi are things like mushrooms or like yeasts. Those are all fungi. So we have this fungus that really creates most of the structure of the lichen, most of the weight of the lichen, and then the algae are living in the structure created by the lichen. They are not inside of the cells of the lichen, but they're kind of wrapped around by the lichen. The idea here is that the algae can photosynthesize, so they perform that wonderful alchemy of taking carbon dioxide powered by the sun and creating oxygen and sugars, right? And so they're able to create sugars essentially out of air. And a lot of those sugars end up being shuttled to the fungus, right? So the fungus gets most of its nutrients from the algae. And if we think about this as a mutualism where both of these partners should benefit, the algae are in this kind of protected area that the fungus creates. That's been our definition of lichens for a long time. This one fungus, one alga. But actually it took a long time to even figure that out. So this, what we call the dual nature of lichens or the symbiosis, wasn't actually proposed until the late 1800s by Simon Schwendener, who was a German botanist, and nobody believed him. A notable exception is Beatrix Potter, who was an excellent scientist and mycologist who was fully on board with that. But most people actually didn't accept that definition of lichens until like the mid 1900s. And so if you really think about it, we haven't even been conceptualizing lichens as these symbioses for, we're not even to the 100-year mark. But in the meantime, we've actually discovered that lichens are much more complicated than we ever thought they were before. So in addition to that main fungal partner, main algal partner, there's actually this like entire miniature ecosystem in every single lichen that you look at. So there are incredibly diverse bacterial communities. There are other fungi in addition to the main symbiont. There are usually a bunch of different algae in there. And then there are things like small worms called nematodes, and there often are tardigrades hanging out around lichens. And so there's just these bustling hubs of biodiversity that are really form this cohesive unit that we see. And if ever I could just shrink down and go into something like really tiny, it would be a lichen to experience what all is happening in there. Lichens seem to be pretty okay with space as well. That nice orange one that you see around a lot, the elegant sunburst lichens, Xanthoria elegans, they've actually sent that lichen into space and exposed it, fully to the vacuum and the cold of space, brought it back to Earth, gave it some water, and it was fine. And and what I think is even cooler is that there's a research group that actually put lichens into a growth chamber that mimics the conditions on Mars. And not only were they fine, but there was some physiological activity. So not all lichens, but many lichens are what we call extremophiles. So they can withstand what we as humans would consider very extreme conditions. So if you think about like Antarctica or the northern pole, lichens are some of the most diverse organisms there. In Antarctica, for sure, lichens are the most diverse terrestrial, so on the land, macroscopic organisms. And similarly, if you ever make it up to the Arctic, you'll see that lichens are the dominant organisms up there. So it's pretty amazing what some of these species that are really exquisitely adapted to these cold, dry climates can handle. And essentially what's going on is that lichens are masters of what we call of desiccation, so completely drying out and becoming inactive and just waiting. And it's really that they're like the water content in the body of the lichen, which we call the thallus. So we call each lichen its thallus when we look at it, is at like equilibrium with the water in the environment. So if it rains, they're wet. If it's very dry, they're very dry. They're not like plants that have these internal tubing systems that can move water around in their bodies to hydrate in various places. Instead, lichens kind of take this tact of just, oh, okay, there's no water, just shut it all down. We'll just wait for it to rain again, no problem. And so some lichens are extremely good at that. So that's one key to being an extremophile, which water bears can do as well. The other thing is that lichens produce all of these chemical compounds that are really unique that no other organisms on the planet make. And we're getting close to having identified 1,000 unique chemical compounds from lichens. A lot of those are pigments, and those pigments actually either absorb or reflect ultraviolet light. And so that protects the lichens from the damage that ultraviolet light causes them, right? Like Ultraviolet light causes problems in our skin as humans, also can be a problem for other organisms. So if you think about that lovely orange lichen, that orange pigment is actually absorbing ultraviolet light. So they make their own sunscreen. They can dry out completely. And then this like fantastic combination of fungi and algae is also a key to this, right? So this mutualistic symbiosis, these organisms working together. So they have different roles in like co-creating this fabulously tough organism. That's another key part of lichens' abilities to grow in these seemingly otherwise uninhabitable places. Many of the extremophiles tend to be crustose lichens. Not all of them, but many of them are. So lichens come in what we call three major growth forms or three general flavors. We have crustose lichens, which grow completely attached to whatever they're living on. So whether that's a rock or a tree or the ground, they're totally attached to it. If you were to try to pull that lichen off of whatever they're growing on, they just fall apart. And the other two major growth forms are foliose lichens and fruticose lichens. So crustose, foliose, and fruticose. So foliose lichens are leaf-like, which is kind of indicated in their name. And while they might be attached across their lower surface to whatever they're growing on, bark or rocks, they have a distinct lower layer of tissue that they create that's more of a barrier to the environment instead of having their internal tissue directly attached to the substrate like we see in crustose lichens. So foliose lichens, very leaf-like. Basically, they have a top and a bottom. And so if you're ever confused, if you kind of try to flick it up or poke at it, and if you can see, oh, there's a bottom, like a different color than the top. This is kind of flat, it's foliose lichen. The third type are fruticose lichens, which are really three-dimensional. They're shrubby or brushy or hairy, or the fairy cups, if you've ever seen those fall into this category. Reindeer lichens, what some people call them reindeer mosses. They are not mosses, but reindeer lichens, horsehair lichen, witch's hair, the old man's beard. These are all of your kind of fruticose lichens. Lichen reproduction, it can get complicated. If you ever took a biology class and you saw this like life cycle diagram and there was just this one circle, right? So with lichens, we have to envision three different circles. Any given one can be happening at once, or they could all three be happening at the same time. So they're different ways that they reproduce. First, I'll talk about what we would call symbiotic reproduction, where they make special structures where the fungus and the alga disperses together. And so there's a whole like range of morphological diversity in these structures, but essentially they're just various types of bundles of fungal and algal cells that can break off of a lichen really easily and start a new lichen with all of the symbionts intact, just like ready to go again. So this is kind of symbiotic reproduction. Then other modes of reproduction involve the fungus reproducing on its own. So the fungus can make asexual spores, so spores that are clones of the original fungus, and those can go off on their own. But then in that case, they need to find a suitable alga in the right place, resynthesize the symbiosis, grow back to a lichen. And then the fungus can also produce spores via sexual reproduction. So there's some recombining of genes, like shuffling around of genes. Again, the result of that is a spore that has to go out and disperses, finds an alga, resynthesizes the symbiosis, and can grow again. Now, if you like imagine just like looking at a lichen, if you've ever seen circular structures on them or disc-like structures on them that are different color, those are what are making the sexual fungal spores. We call those apothecia. So you may have actually seen lichens reproducing at some point. And those are actually perennial structures and they can hang out there on the lichen for years and years. So, and then the asexual structures are harder to see. It's pretty cool because a lot of lichens can reproduce in multiple different ways all at the same time. So they're kind of maximizing the reshuffling of genes, reshuffling of symbionts, but also, you know, if they've landed on this like great fungus algal combination, they're in a lovely place, they just like clone and clone and clone and clone themselves and can just disperse locally and grow at will. They're kind of like brilliant dispersers in some ways. And yet, it's also a really tricky thing, and it's an area of lichen biology we're still trying to understand better, is just even though they're making all of these reproductive structures, we don't actually know exactly how successful any given one is, how far any given reproductive structure might go. And unlike studying, I don't know, dispersal in plants where maybe you can actually see the seeds or something like this, it's really hard to see like a 5 micrometer across spore go off into the world and figure out what happened to that. So when we study lichen dispersal and reproduction, we end up having to use a lot of population genetics tools. So looking at the genetics of the lichens, and this is a lot of what my lab at Eastern Washington University was looking at, and kind of an area of research I started when I was a graduate student was trying to better understand, are rare species less effective at dispersing than common species? Is that part of why they're rare? Or is it that they're more specifically adapted to habitats or microclimates that don't exist elsewhere? So by looking at the genetics, we can kind of start to get at that. And it does seem that, I feel like in science, this is always the answer, all of that is happening. But it does look like indeed rare species don't disperse as much or as far as common species. And they also are much more sensitive to differences in habitat and climate. So it's a combination of that going on. I consider myself an integrative biologist because I like to do interdisciplinary science, and I ask a lot of different questions and I kind of follow my curiosity. One of the through lines, though, in my research has been basic biodiversity documentation and discovery of lichens. So there are about 20,000 described species of lichens on the planet, somewhere between 5 and 6,000 in North America. Interestingly, there have been almost 1,000 different species documented from Washington state. It's a very diverse state, right? Which is pretty cool. I don't think I'm the biggest contributor. I would say there have been a lot of lichenologists in the Northwest working for many decades. Yeah, I would say representative of a lot of people's work for sure. Basic biodiversity documentation, it's really fun to just to go out and see like who is here, what species are here, where are they. We usually take samples and preserve those in natural history collections so that they can continue to be studied for centuries, ideally. And I think that that type of research is really important at this juncture in history because we're in this moment of incredibly rapid environmental change. And so, in a lot of ways, that work is focused on taking a snapshot of biodiversity at this point in history on this planet and leaving a really carefully documented record for people in the future. And we can also look at how our data compared to natural history collections from the past, because people started making natural history collections in right around the 1500s. So we have some records to look at over a fair bit of time. So that's been a lot of my research. I've also studied the impact of climate change on lichens, looking at sea level rise and the potential for mountaintop extinction. More recently, I've been working in lichen genomics, so looking at the whole genomes of lichens, and that has been fascinating. So we've made a few really interesting discoveries in my lab, kind of along that path. And one is the wolf lichen that you see, that like bright green yellow one all over the place, is genetically pretty interesting, which I didn't expect at the time. I just was like, oh, it's everywhere. I have to figure out how these methods work. I need to develop this method for being able to sequence the genomes because nobody had done it before. And start with something big and easy and right in my backyard. And then it turns out that it's quite the anomaly. So most lichens and most fungi in this group where lichens are, and I'm specifically, again, talking about the fungal partner, have one copy of all of their DNA in every cell. We have two, right? So we get one set from our mothers and one set from our fathers. But fungi, usually they just have one. It's a very efficient genome. To our knowledge, all lichenized fungi have one per cell. I didn't expect anything different to happen, but the wolf lichen actually has three per cell. So it's what we call triploid. Yeah, so first and still only triploid lichen that we know of. That was pretty exciting. So then One of the next things we looked at was I explained how with lichen reproduction, there are a whole bunch of different ways that they can reproduce. Well, there's this group of lichens called the fairy dust lichens, which immediately you have to love because they have a great name. This is the genus Lipraria, and they only reproduce with these special bundles of fungal and algal cells. So nobody has ever seen them make a spore anywhere in the world ever. They seem to have lost the ability to reproduce sexually. So no reshuffling of genes and making these like structures that we can see. Now, in evolutionary biology, this is really anomalous. One of our fundamental assumptions is that sexual reproduction is required, especially in eukaryotic organisms. During that gene reshuffling, like mutations that are deleterious can kind of be gotten rid of. And there's various evolutionary theories around this. So it shouldn't really happen. So we were curious to see, well, do these fairy dust lichens still have the genes, like the basic genetic machinery to reproduce sexually, even if they aren't, to our knowledge? And they do. They have all of the basic fundamental genes involved that are required for sexual reproduction in fungi. So it was like one of those studies where the answer just means that it's still a mystery. But at least we have one more puzzle piece in there, right? So that was pretty cool. And now one of my master students who's still at Eastern, Juliana Paulson, she's actually looking at jumping genes in lichens. So if you've ever heard of Barbara McClintock, and she discovered these genes that can like move around in genomes. So one of the really cool things we found is that Pseudocyphalaria rainierensis, which is the old growth speckled belly lichen. Sorry, that was like a mouthful. Oh, that's even a long scientific name for me to say. So this lichen, which I've been studying in collaboration with Lalita Calabria at Evergreen State College and Stephen Sherritt, who recently finished his master's degree at Eastern. It's a rare species. It's definitely a threatened species in Washington State. And Steve and Lalita were really spearheading this study of trying to figure out where is it still growing, how is it doing, things like this. So then we started collaborating on the genetics of the species, and it turns out that this lichen's genome was massive, much, much larger than any lichen genome we've ever seen, and that 70% of its genome is occupied by these jumping genes that move around in the genome. Juliana now has been following up on that because we saw this happening in some other rare lichens as well, where these kind of autonomous genetic elements proliferate in the genome. Anyways, it's really wild. So she's following up on that to see, like, do we see this happening a lot in rare species? And that's pretty cool because some interesting implications of this, if this was the case, is that maybe if we sequence a lichen's genome and we find that there are a lot of these jumping genes, or what we call mobile genetic elements, that could be one indicator that they're rare or threatened. Sometimes in organisms, this starts to happen, this proliferation of these genes, because when the organism is stressed out, it's not as able to prevent that proliferation from happening. So it could be an indicator of a species experiencing environmental stress. Again, this is a project where we're definitely going to be left with even more questions, but it's been really interesting to follow up on that because we have this really large data set that we've built in my lab that we are able to ask some of these questions and start following up on some of these, what I think are really interesting questions about how the genomes of lichens evolve. And usually we're asking these questions in the context of conservation and their responses to environmental change. Lichens are used as bioindicators in many countries around the world. They are very sensitive to sulfur-based air pollution. Many lichens are really sensitive to nitrogen-based pollution. Earlier on in the Industrial Revolution, and then all the way up through like the 1950s and 1960s, especially in a lot of countries, what we saw was this massive decline in lichens, especially in cities where they were pretty much completely wiped out of cities like London, New York City, et cetera, where you had a lot of industrial activities. And it wasn't until in the United States, at least, the Clean Air Act in the 70s that we started to see lichens come back, especially in cities. We've seen this massive rebound in lichens. So getting rid of sulfur-based pollution was obviously really helpful for human health and also for lichen diversity. And now in terms of air pollution, we're more concerned about nitrogen-based pollution, both from agricultural settings, but also from the burning of fossil fuels. And what has ended up being like some pretty massive nitrogen input to ecosystems around the globe can kind of disrupt a lot of those ecosystem level processes. And lichens can be a really helpful indicator of nitrogen deposition. There are some lichens that we call nitrophiles, so they're nitrogen loving, but most lichens are oligotrophs, which means they prefer like low nutrient systems, so low nitrogen. So if you go to a place and you look at what lichens are there and how abundant each species are, you can actually calculate an air quality score. And the proportion of nitrogen loving versus non-nitrogen loving, how abundant they are. Even in a really remote place, you can go and do that. And you could detect, oh, wow, there's a lot of nitrogen deposition happening here that we didn't know about, or maybe not, or maybe it's okay. That's like a lichen community-based monitoring approach. And then the other way that lichens are used as bioindicators or biomonitors is that scientists collect lichens and then they look at the different elements in the body of the lichens and then they can see, okay, there's like actually like a lot of heavy metals here, or you can get into finer detail like, oh, there is a lot of nitrogen being deposited here and it's mostly from agricultural sources versus fossil fuels, things like this. So that's kind of this element analysis. So that's another way lichens can be used as biomonitors, which is something people do sometimes near mines to see like their heavy metal contamination still here. Now, the community-based approach and some of that elemental analysis has been done really extensively over huge amounts of the United States, led by the US Forest Service for decades. And so in the United States, so much of our information and knowledge of our air quality actually comes from lichens. This is like kind of, people don't usually know about it. There have been thousands and thousands of plots done all over the US by so many different scientists to monitor over time changes in air quality using lichens. Like Linda Geiser has been one of the leaders in this area in the United States for a really long time. And she's incredible. There are actually a lot of human uses of lichens. I think people, often don't think of it, but that because they're not necessarily your clothes are made from them or you're eating them every day. But the chemistry of lichens has been used quite a lot actually throughout human history because they are a wonderful natural source of dyes. They're one of the only natural sources of purple dyes, for instance. So you do have to get the purple, you have to ferment particular lichens in ammonia, which maybe you wouldn't necessarily have bought a bottle of ammonia in the past. I'll just let you think about that. Um, but they do make this most beautiful purple color. You can also get a lot of yellows and some greenish and some pinkish colors as well. So humans have used them for dyes for quite a long time. They also produce a lot of antifungal and antibacterial compounds. So like old man's beard, that yellow green of it is a compound that's called usnic acid. It's a really strong antibacterial compound. And that has been used to dress wounds and also in tinctures. This is one of my like public service health announcements, which is that is also a liver toxin. So if anybody is using usnea tinctures, use them in great moderation. They are actually toxic. And also the wolf lichen is one of the only actually like toxic lichens out there. You don't hear about lichen poisonings because you're not like out there collecting them to eat very often because they don't actually taste that good. I have had lichens prepared in a way that was quite tasty once before, but generally they're not very delicious. So that there are various ways that we use the chemistry of lichens, and there are quite a few researchers around the globe exploring ways to use them for human health applications. So many of them are like anti-proliferatives that could be useful for treating cancers, and in addition to like a potential source for novel antifungals and antibacterial compounds. This is crazy. This is one of those reasons I just love fungi. At this point, there have been over 2,000 fungal species named that are what we call lichenicolous fungi. So fungi that inhabit lichens or infect lichens. They're like parasites and pathogens. So they're not the main symbiont. They're another fungus that grows on lichens only and specifically. So some of those actually cause like gall-like structures, like you would see when an insect or a fungus infects a plant. And so there's a need for lichens to protect themselves from other fungi. The way that they can produce a toxin that kills fungi without killing themselves comes down to the cell biology. And so they can like keep those toxic substances in separate compartments inside of the cell until they're secreted, for instance. That's one of a few ways they can protect themselves when they're making these toxic compounds. So this is part of what I'm doing in my current position. So I joined this cell biology lab where they're studying creation of these special compounds in fungi, because we know a little bit about how this happens at the cellular level, but not very much. So we're kind of trying to figure out how they move around in the cell, how the different chemical reactions happen, where they happen, what's some of the basic cellular machinery that is fundamental to the production of all these crazy and useful and interesting compounds that fungi make. Implications for human health. It has implications if we think about agricultural systems. It has implications for thinking about the ecology and evolution. The lab I'm currently in, we're thinking a little bit more about human health because human fungal pathogens are on the rise globally. There are new human fungal pathogens arising, and many of them are just becoming more common and frequent. So it's becoming more and more of a health concern for people. And then as far as indigenous uses, that is not an area of lichenology that is my greatest expertise. So I think you have to talk to somebody who has a lot more experience that aspect of lichenology to get the full story. But one thing that I do know is that what some people call the horsehair lichen, which is Bryoria fremontii, especially in the Northwest, used as a source of food. And it was also used to like make into things like slippers. So you could it can mat quite nicely and be used to make some types of garments. Definitely those uses are there. And those uses are there documented for indigenous people all over the world. Tons of animals eat lichens. Moose, elk, deer, rabbits, pikas, squirrels, voles. I just listed mostly mammals, but they have all been documented to eat lichens, mountain goats. And lichens are more or less of an important part of their diet, and it maybe varies seasonally, but definitely it's part of many mammals' diets. The animals for which lichens are the foundation of their diet are caribou or reindeer, right? And they can eat many, many kilograms of lichens every day. In the tundra, so the tundra caribou, you can kind of imagine why this might be. There aren't as many plants, there are tons of lichens, and they are mostly browsing on lichens, both in the winter and in the summer. Now, the woodland caribou, for a long time, people hypothesized that, well, lichens are probably only a winter forage, right? Like they're less desirable than the plants. They're probably only eating them in winter. But it turns out that based on a study where people actually like put collars with cameras on the caribou, watched them eat, and also looked at their scat and did some DNA testing, that actually even the woodland caribou eat lichens year round. So lichens are really fundamental to supporting healthy caribou populations. And this is important because woodland caribou are really declining throughout their ranges in North America. So just a few years ago, we lost the last two caribou individuals from the United States. They were in the Selkirk Range in North Idaho, and at that point, they just actually physically moved those last two individuals because they couldn't sustain themselves at that point. But caribou used to live, throughout northeastern Washington, Idaho, Montana, pretty far south, and now you have to go, really go up to BC. to see them. And it's probably a lot of reasons that we're seeing massive declines in the caribou populations. So logging for sure, the kind of habitat loss, probably climate change, but a lot of it has to do with the lichens. And especially because I think this is something that can be hard to see if you're not looking for it, but if a forest is logged and it regrows, and you might even see some larger trees or something, the lichens, though, take longer to come back. And once a forest is logged, all of the lichens they never all come back. I think there's sometimes, how could the caribou not be here? There's pretty good sized forest and this and that. Yeah, but the lichens aren't there. Their main food source isn't there. So lichens are an important diet component for some animals. Lichens are not resilient to high intensity fires. So they burn up and they die. So there aren't any lichens that are well fire adapted, right? Whereas some pine trees, like after a fire, then their seeds will germinate. We don't have any examples of that with lichens. And so in somewhere like the Pacific Northwest, historical fire regimes where you have patchy fires, maybe lower intensity fires, those were certainly not a threat to the lichens. And now seeing these massive high intensity fires, if you go into an area that burned afterwards, especially if the fire gets into the crown, the lichens will have all been burnt up. So they're really not very resilient to those types of fires. Some cases, if some of them make it through, right, they can recolonize. Or if we think of more like the kind of shrub steppe habitats in Washington, if you had like a lower intensity fires and anywhere that's like not quite as invaded by cheatgrass or other annual invasive grasses, the soil crust lichens are usually okay. It really depends. And I think at this point, what we know is that, yeah, these large, high intensity fires, we lose lichens. And there are a few lichenologists in the Northwest who are now studying how long does it take for them to come back, who comes back, what does that look like? And we don't really know yet on the coming back question. They are also used by birds pretty frequently, so for nesting material and for food. So especially if you see sometimes like hummingbirds especially decorate their nests with lots of lichens, which is pretty delightful. And then thinking about smaller animals, tons of invertebrates use lichens as camouflage and food and shelter. And favorite story in this realm goes back to the fairy dust lichens and to lacewing larvae, which if you're looking at lichens, especially these fairy dust lichens, sometimes they'll grow in like pretty big patches on rocks and bark and things. And all of a sudden it starts moving, which is always shocking. You're like, oh, like this lichen is moving. Sometimes what's going on is that there's a lacewing larva under there and it's glued tons of lichens on its back. So it has this like lichen shell covering, which is great camouflage. Also, the fairy dust lichens are really good at repelling water. So it's like a rain jacket, and they make tons of these antimicrobial compounds. So also very clean, really like the perfect coat, honestly. And it gets even better because when they go to metamorphose, they then take and completely encapsulate themselves in the fairy dust lichen, turn into an adult insect, and then they'll cut this like perfect little cap out of the top and pop it open, and out they go as a beautiful adult lacewing larva. So like one of those just wonderful magical stories in nature that just seems like almost too delightful to be real, but it is, and it's just super fun. So I hope that some of you have a chance to go out and see this yourselves. For anybody who's interested in learning more about lichens, you're in the Pacific Northwest, so you're very lucky to have an organization that's fabulous. So the Northwest Lichenologists is a really active, really wonderful group of people. Their website is full of resources. If you join, there are forums that you can put pictures of lichens up and get suggestions on how to identify them or to learn more. So it's a really awesome group, and they meet once a year as well. So if you want to go meet people in person, so if you're ready to be that level of lichen nut, then go for it with that group. if you're thinking, I think I'll read a book first, I would say Macrolichens of the Pacific Northwest by Linda Geiser and Bruce McCune is great. This is a big ticket item book, but it's so awesome. It's The Lichens of North America by Ernie Brodo and then Steve Sharnoff and Sylvia Sharnoff. And it was published like 20 years ago now by Yale University Press, but it's still very much, what would I say? It's like so useful and it's so beautiful. It's just exceptionally wonderful book. And I think those would be my two biggest suggestions. I don't know if people tune in from further afield in California. There's the California Lichen Society, which is great. Also, if you ever see a local lichen walk, I think lichens are a really hard thing to teach yourself, having attempted it early in my life. So if you can find a lichen specialist and go walking with them and have them point stuff out, that's really the best way to go. So in Seattle, there's a woman named Catherine Glue who often gives a lot of lichen walks. And again, if you go to the Northwest Lichenologist webpage, they have an events area. And so usually if lichen specialists are giving workshops or lichen walks, you can kind of get a hint at what events are coming up there.
This podcast is produced by Okanogan Highlands Alliance. OHA is based in Tonasket, a town in the heart of the Okanogan Valley of north central Washington. We are inspired by the beauty and diversity of the landscape that surrounds us, from the aspen and conifer forests to the highland lakes to the tumbling creeks that descend to the wide, glacier-carved Okanogan River Valley. We engage in environmental advocacy, habitat restoration, and educational activities in our efforts to protect local ecosystems for future generations. To learn more about OHA or to become a member, please visit our website, www.okanoganhighlands.org. This podcast is made awesome by Jessica Allen, whose enthusiasm for lichen is inspiring. We hope you are excited to get outside and discover new life forms. Our theme song, Blessed Unrest, is written and performed by Tyler Graves and Andy Kingham. You can support the artists by finding and downloading the full song from your favorite music platform.
Blessed unrest.